example of one of the projects that we're working on and a very high-level overview of how we're approaching energy security, and I'd be happy to take questions or talk more specifically if you're interested. Thank you.
So going back to that artist rendition of what a new city feels like, what kind of policy is that, kind of future policy is there that doesn't exist now?
Well, so that I'll refer to a story. So originally I went into energy policy, and my family thought I was out of my mind because we basically live in a country with no energy policy. And then they really thought I was out of my mind when I went to National Laboratory because we don't do policy, we can inform policy. So in that sense, the policy that exists right now, seeing what Bob put up, it got us into, frankly, a bit of a mess. So I would say that, it's our opportunity right now to build it, and it's really starting from a either negative or kind of ground zero starting point.
So based on that image, though, how are you addressing energy and efficiency kind of design that might inform future policy?
So the way that the key point of how we're approaching it is from a more integrated systems perspective. So we want to inform energy policy and energy decisions, not just for the sake of energy, but for the sake of other factors. So if we can do that integrated design, we can plan energy in a way that we can show the impact and effects on other key areas, like I said, such as air quality or maybe stormwater or transportation planning. We can see those interdependencies, whereas right now it's just energy for energy's sake.
Maybe I could just add, one of the really interesting questions is if you look at the picture, like south. There. So the region that's directly west of the Lakeside is an area that is rather poor. And one of the things about poor areas in Chicago is that they're underserved in many ways. One of them is they have very expensive access to energy. Their houses are insulated, they pay a lot, and especially given their economic. So one of the things that Lakeside will do is change the way that energy can be used in the South Side. The developers are talking about doing basically the way it's kind of central heating, distributed central heating. District, thank you. Just district heating. And one of the interesting questions is to what extent can the developer push district heating out into the surrounding neighborhoods? It's much cheaper than what we have access to right now.
District heating is just a local production.
So you have combined cycle plants that produce both electricity as well as heat. The University of Chicago, for example, has one that's on the northwest side of the campus, and so you can produce both the energy for maintaining airport, heat, cooling, and heating, as well as producing energy. And it's, first of all, it's a much more efficient way of producing both heat and electricity. The second is that it gives the folks that are west of this area a reason for why you would favor this development. Usually what happens in urban environments is when you have urban renewal coming in, the first thing that happens is to push all the people who live there. That's going to disturb the South Side. And so the idea here is to actually help the people that live there, live in this area, actually benefit from the presence of this development. That's a major factor in how you rethinking how you develop a city.
Other potential ideas in particular are things like toilets for separating, urine separation, which produce nutrient fertilizer for every room, biogas for local, biogas that you can use on the site, things like district heating. So it's thinking that it's pretty fresh. From the start, you have to build that infrastructure at the front end. You can't retrofit.
So what policy or lack of policy is in the way of creating this district heating now?
Well, again, it's not how do we do it? Does it make sense? And does it have these kind of secondary or tertiary benefits that Bob is talking about? So I don't necessarily think there's anything necessarily in the way of it, but how do we really understand it and how do we do it is the question. And again, coming back to a point that Bob made, if fossil fuels are the cheapest way of doing this, how do we actually understand what the other benefits are and factor those into the cost associated with the site? And then how does that actually increase the value of the site?
I have a question, I guess, more about project strategy. So, I mean, it seems like this project is in large part conceptual at this point, and you're really working on sort of modeling and conceptualizing the future city. Do you, I guess, do you have a lot of those players that, you know, that are thinking the utilities, government officials in Chicago, are they already at the table helping advise you, or is this sort of thing where you're sort of doing the conceptual process, laying the groundwork, and then you will develop some type of large network of advisory council or something? I mean, obviously you need many different players. The utilities, I mean, would be, you know, huge people you have to have at the table for something like this, because there are a lot of things you got to overcome. You know,
Sure,
policy,
absolutely.
technology, and a lot of things to overcome.
So the answer to that is there are a number of different parties that are involved in this project. We're working closely with Skidmore, Owens & Merrill. They're responsible for the urban master plan. McCaffrey, our developers, are working with the Energy Trust to actually look at how do we commercialize some of the technology that's going in here. And this site, I think what's beneficial about this site is it is highly visible. It's prime property just south of the Chicago Loop. And to that end, you know, we really have no choice. It really forces us to get out and we need to work with the utilities, we need to work with others, actually come to the table. And there are, like I said, you know, sometimes it's almost, you know, I think it's just, it's almost unwieldy how many people are at the table, but that's really the way it has to be. And that's one of the things that we're going to work through on this project.
Real quick, any international collaborations on this particular topic?
So, you know, I was approached by the IEA not too long ago, and you know, we would certainly like to be involved with them. They're working on community energy, they call it Annex. It's more or less just a number of countries coming together to work to do this. So they've shown quite a bit of interest. We're not formally working with them right now, but we would certainly like to be, and I'm keeping an eye on what they're doing and vice versa. So I think the more that we can do that, the better. And I think that's also included in our project planning strategies, that as soon as we move past the conceptualization and getting the prototype built, that's when we really start having these conversations with other countries who are doing similar work. Because if we don't do that, I think we then really lose opportunity that we have here.
There's one more question.
I was just wondering, I work here at Argonne too, as with the Joint Hire with Northern Illinois, and I sat in on a bunch of the DOE briefings, you know, with their fiscal year announcements for funding for next year. And by and large, DOE, you know, is very supply side oriented, it seems to me. And you know, this project is I think really cool in that you can like envision a sustainable city and kind of put all these decision matrix. But like, do you have similar projects going on for the actual existing city of Chicago to reduce its energy footprint? Are we trying to like, or is this just focused on building brand new cities from the ground up? Because you know, I've asked questions like that at a bunch of different conferences, and it seems like the focus is so much on, oh, if we could totally redo it, we have a blank canvas, we do it this way. There's a lot of research to that end, but you know, we have like existing, you know, housing infrastructure exists. It consumes 40% of our energy, and you know, we need to, I think, focus on that.
So, I agree.
Yeah.
And there's actually, I like always have it's nice to have a good story for once, and there's actually, I think, a good story to be told with this, and I'll make it brief. So, as I mentioned, the point here is an integrated platform.
Right.
The first piece, if you will, that we actually put into our integrated platform was an energy assessment tool that was funded by the Department of Energy to come up with a more efficient way to do energy measurements in existing buildings. That was something that we did here at Argonne. It came out of DOE funding to actually look at the city of Chicago. And what we did was build a new energy assessment tool for existing buildings, and we actually tested them on real buildings in the Chicago Loop. So I think that there is a story to be told with that, because that really was the first integration piece, and it came out of funding that think that there needs to be more of that. I'm, personally hoping that we can actually use this as a story to say, we can actually see where things are applicable in existing buildings to new buildings and to existing as well. And I think that there's a bit of a story here, and I hope that there are more, and I hope that we can use this to get people to really think that way, because completely agree, there needs to be more of that. And I think part of this is that there's a story to be told. It's very exciting, and there's a lot of opportunity here. And if we can use that opportunity to help really with the existing buildings, that would be a tremendous success for us. Thank you.
Our final panelist today is Jody Andrews from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's an assistant professor of law in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences. She's also an affiliate at the University's Energy Biosciences Institute, EBI. She received her JD at the University of Illinois College of Law, and her research focuses on the nexus between agriculture, environmental, and energy policies. And she'll be giving a bit of an outlook on bioenergy policy in the U.S.
While you're getting that up, shifting gears a little bit here from a law professor perspective, and I'm going to talk about the uncertainties created by litigation over particularly biomass-based energy. And my hypothesis is that we're really in a time of great uncertainty. As Bob mentioned, Leah mentioned that the United States really does lack a comprehensive, at least federal energy policy. For example, we don't have a renewable portfolio standard, we don't have a cap and trade standard, we don't have a low carbon fuel standard. Our main policies at the federal level are a renewable fuel standard, as well as rules that have been sort of cobbled together under the Clean Air Act, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in subsequent slides. We do have pretty significant monetary support for biomass-based renewable energy technologies, but in my experience at the federal level, they're quite uncoordinated. So that's sort of the chaotic picture that we have at the federal level. So in the absence of a coordinated policy, we rely on 50 different states' policies, and that may make good work for attorneys like me, but doesn't really create an atmosphere of certainty in terms of businesses and government policies that are dealing with biomass-based energy. So California has really been forced to take the lead, but as you'll see, that legally is a bit precarious, and we have a lot of gaps and inconsistencies between state laws. And I think we're starting to see in science and policy this, and it's fascinating to me, having worked in this field for almost 20 years in sustainability policy, how we're starting to recognize that sustainability problems don't really respect jurisdictional boundaries. And therefore, there's sort of a renewed argument that if we're considering ecosystems or even social systems sustainability, that policies have to really go beyond just political boundaries to perhaps a more federally managed sort of, at least overview sort of way of dealing with sustainability policy. But as I'm sure we've concluded out of the days in this conference, that how governments design bioenergy policy will really influence at least the biomass sector's viability, because it's nascent and it's facing increased cost and a real capacity deficit in terms of the technological know-how, the on-the-ground know-how that farmers, consumers of biomass, factories need in terms of being able to actually implement policies, even if we did have them. And there will be, as we've learned from the great work even at Argonne or the national labs, that there will be some positive and negative impacts depending on how we design policy. So I'm going to be just looking at litigation related to the framework for U.S. policy, which is our renewable fuel standard and emissions limitations under the Clean Air Act. I'm going to touch on litigation in California under the low carbon fuel standard, and again, emphasizing the great uncertainty that all of this litigation is creating. And if I have time, I'll touch a little bit on natural gas and a little bit on Clean Water Act policy. So we have several lawsuits ongoing against the renewable fuel standard. That's in addition to all the political lobbying that's going on in Congress to either change or eliminate the renewable fuel standard. So lawsuit number one, we've had a group of oil companies challenge EPA's every year set a blending mandate under the Renewable Fuel Standard. Every year, that gets challenged. If companies can't meet that mandate, they pay a penalty. They have to buy renewable energy credits, basically. So, at least for the 2013 volumetric mandate, oil companies actually won, and EPA had to go back to the drawing board and basically reduce its mandate down, particularly for the second gen, for cellulosic biofuels. So EPA came out with its 2013 revised estimate of 6 million gallons. It's supposed to be about 1 billion. And oil companies a couple weeks ago said, well, we can't even meet that. And they've sued EPA again, saying that even 6 million gallons of cellulosic fuels is unrealistic. It was just leaked again a couple weeks ago that EPA, and I would speculate because of this, and knowing the folks that work in EPA and surrounding policy with this, I think EPA is a little bit nervous. They keep getting sued, and in the court of public opinion, that doesn't look good. So it's been leaked that probably for 2014 they're going to adjust the amounts way down, even for corn-based ethanol. And the lesson out of this is that all of this litigation, even with this first lawsuit, is creating a lot of uncertainty for industries that deal in biomass-based energy. Lawsuit number 2 is when EPA, in sort of conjunction with the Renewable Fuel Standard, attempted to adjust the amount of ethanol that could be blended in the fuel supply from 10% to 15%, they got sued by a group of folks, not just oil companies, but the grocers industry, the cattlemen's, folks that are affected by increased use of biofuels in the transportation fuel supply. They claim that this increased amount from 10% to 15% would cause damage to cars, it would create higher input prices for food, and they sued EPA, and in the legal profession, we call this one of the sort of most famous appellate courts in the country, the DC Circuit, didn't even agree to hear the merits of the lawsuit and threw the lawsuit out on a standing basis, which saying, they hadn't even proven injury, that it was speculative at best. If you want to hear more about this case, I have former students from my Illinois Professional Science Master's students who actually did an 8-week-long project on this lawsuit. But the take-home point in this is that, again, this creates a lot of uncertainty for folks that are in the sector that produce biofuels. So that's the renewable fuels. We also have, and this is probably something that sort of flies under the radar because the Clean Air Act is a bit nebulous and very complicated statute to understand. We also have something called the greenhouse gas tailoring rule that applies to sort of stationary sources of emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. So this final tailoring rule is actually based on one of the most famous environmental law cases in the United States to date in 2007, when the Supreme Court said that EPA must do some sort of analysis, an endangerment analysis, of whether the greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act are endangering public health. And EPA indeed made that determination, an endangerment finding, and this led to restrictions on tailpipe emissions from automobiles. Under the Clean Air Act language, this arguably triggers, once you're regulating tailpipe emissions, it triggers regulations on smokestacks from stationary sources. And I underline the word arguably because this is now being litigated. Backing up a bit though, EPA in regulating stationary sources has promulgated what we call the tailoring rule, which means that typically regulated sources are regulated at 100 to 250 tons per year for criteria pollutant emissions. Because if EPA was to do that for greenhouse gas emissions, they would have to permit over 100,000 different sources of greenhouse gas emissions. They call it the tailoring rule because they decided to go after the large ones first. And this covers around 70% of emissions in the United States, so significant. One part of that rulemaking was that they exempted biomass emissions from co-firing biomass for 3 years while they were considering the science on whether biomass is carbon neutral. So the first lawsuit was that a big group of industry challenged the endangerment finding as being unscientific. Greenhouse gases are indeed not endangering public health, and they lost. Environmental groups, environmental groups are also in this game of playing around with the Clean Air Act and renewable energy. Don't be fooled, it's just industry. They sued the Environmental Protection Agency for exempting biomass emissions for 3 years. And they actually recently, in July, they won. So now EPA has to go back and conduct a rulemaking that calculates the carbon emissions from biogenic carbon. The sort of interesting part of this litigation that we saw in the briefing was that likely EPA is going to do a rulemaking, they're going to apply life cycle analysis, and perhaps they'll come to the same conclusion that it's carbon neutral. I would guess that environmental groups are going to sue again because they're going to argue this sort of text of the Clean Air Act that says you can only consider the carbon emissions at the smokestack, not at the sequestration level, being very textualist in their analysis, which is typically reserved for conservative judges. So if you look under the covers, environmental groups are playing around with the Clean Air Act as well. The lawsuit number 3, and this has really, I think, the broadest ramifications for biomass-based energy, is that when EPA applied the tailoring rule to stationary sources, industry sued as part of their package of suing the endangerment finding and all that, argued that under the text of the Clean Air Act, that EPA really doesn't have the authority to include greenhouse gases, that there's a section of the Clean Air Act under the, we call PSD, for Prevention of Significant Deterioration. That statute says you can regulate for the 6 criteria pollutants, NOx, SOx, particulates, carbon monoxide. It doesn't include greenhouse gases. There's a section of the Clean Air Act above that, a broader section, that EPA can regulate all pollutants. So now, our DC Circuit was called on to reconcile when industry sued for this sort of regulation. The appellate court had to reconcile the language that EPA can regulate any pollutant, and thus the tailpipe emission rule-triggered stationary source regulation, versus a very narrow textualist reading of the PSD provision that says you can only regulate criteria pollutants of which greenhouse gases are not included in that. The appellate court read the statute the way I think they should read it, in a reasonable way, saying that our decision in Massachusetts versus EPA, the foundation for the endangerment finding, says that greenhouse gases are pollutants. It only makes sense that if you're regulating them as tailpipe emissions, you would regulate them as stationary sources as well. There was a request for an en banc hearing in front of all the judges. That was denied, but there was a dissent from that by 2 judges. One of the judges, which in the biogenic carbon accounting case, also said that those emissions could not be regulated under the PSD section. Surprisingly, last week the Supreme Court agreed to take certiorari on the very narrow issue. They're not going to review the endangerment finding, they're not going to review the tailpipe emissions rule, but they have agreed to review this statutory interpretation of issue of whether EPA can apply greenhouse gas limitations to stationary sources. And that's a big thing. We've had a change in the Supreme Court since 2007, which was a 5-4 decision on the Massachusetts versus EPA decision that said greenhouse gases are pollutants for purposes of the Clean Air Act. So there's a bit of fear now because we have different justices. We've replaced John Paul Stevens as one of the most well-known sort of liberal environmental jurists on the court with Elena Kagan, who's much more of a textualist, seen as much less of an environmental sort of advocate as John Paul Stevens. The swing vote will probably be Justice Kennedy, as like it is in all cases. As a law professor, I really couldn't tell you where it would come down. I think it's significant that they even agreed to take cert, and we'll have to see whether the textualists in the court, the Alitos, the Roberts, the Scalias, whether they win in terms of reading that part of the statute very narrowly, saying EPA, you can only regulate the 6 criteria pollutants and not greenhouse gases. We'll see where Kennedy lies on that. The last bit of litigation is the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And this is a rule that was finalized in 2009, where if anyone sells fuels in California, they have to gradually reduce their carbon footprint, basically. You can either avail yourself of a default carbon footprint that California has come up with, or you can do your own individual calculations under what's called 2A, 2B pathway analysis. A group of Midwestern sort of ethanol interests and oil interests sued California, saying that you cannot apply carbon accounting, life cycle analysis, extraterritorially in two parts of carbon accounting. Transportation emissions from hauling ethanol from Iowa to California, and penalizing the emissions that Midwestern ethanol plants have by burning or by using coal-fired electricity. We have this, what used to be very dormant commerce clause in the Constitution, but it's been sort of revived because of our conservative justices now that dominate the court, that says a state cannot pass a law that's either discriminatory against commerce on its face, interstate commerce, or if it's not discriminatory on its face, but discriminatory in its effect, you still can't do that unless you can, your state interest outweighs the burden on commerce. This is in the US Constitution. So this group of folks sued in federal court. They won at the district court level. The district court said it's discriminatory on its face to apply this life cycle carbon accounting to Midwestern corn ethanol on these two bases. But the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, it's a 3-judge panel, one of the judges that I worked for when she was a district judge, overturned the district court decision saying that the low carbon fuel standard is not on its face discriminatory. Because think about how, even though ethanol, if you ship it from the Midwest to California, yes, it receives a carbon penalty. But if you're an ethanol industry in California, you have to ship corn to California, which is heavier, and thus would be a greater carbon penalty. So it's treating California and Midwestern interests equally, so it's not discriminatory. The court also sort of, and it's a pretty long analysis, but basically they concluded that it's not California's fault that Midwestern ethanol facilities chose to locate by coal-fired electricity, and that many ethanol plants have actually switched away from that, which demonstrates that California is achieving the innovation that it sought to achieve in the low carbon fuel standard. I would say that undoubtedly this will be appealed to the United States Supreme Court. There's already been a motion for rehearing filed with the full Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. I doubt that they will overturn this 3-judge panel, but I bet it will go to the Supreme Court. After they decided to take the tailoring rule, I'm not sure that they won't decide to take this case. And again, based on the makeup of the Supreme Court, I'm not sure how the case will come out. There is a question regarding Supreme Court precedent about states being able to apply penalties for environmental damage or externalities for industries that operate within their states to be able to charge them their fair share. So I think California has some good case law on its side. It depends on how well they argue it, I guess. I just gave a talk in Brazil, and they wanted to talk a lot about natural gas policy and its effect and uncertainty on the biomass-based industry. And I was surprised that many of them didn't know about this blanket exemption for natural gas from federal environmental laws, because we talk about natural gas being this innovation, but part of that innovation is quote-unquote innovation in the application of environmental laws. So we have this complete sort of exemption from federal environmental laws. That doesn't mean that states can't apply their rules outside of federal rules, but they've been very reluctant to do so, and localities have been very unsuccessful in doing that as well. President Obama appears to be sort of sitting on the scientific studies, been ordered by Congress to study the environmental impacts of fracking. I think it was held up until after the election. It's still being held up. We're waiting for some scientific studies on environmental effects. Whether or not, even if those studies come out saying that there are great environmental effects that shouldn't be exempted from environmental law, I don't know what type of action Congress will take on that. I don't know what type of action EPA will attempt, because statutorily EPA's hands are tied. But in the end, if these exemptions were eliminated, perhaps natural gas would not be as cheap and would play as big a role in our energy conversations as we see it today. The last bit of really interesting litigation that has went on just the past couple months, really keeping a lot of us in the renewable energy policy world busy, is 2 recent cases by federal courts on water quality. We have a decision out of the Middle District of Pennsylvania, the Chesapeake Bay